2010 Radnor Township Shade Tree Commission meeting. We have a very brief agenda this evening regarding plan reviews. The first plan, and the only plan review, is 417 East Lancaster Avenue. So we have representation here tonight. If you could come to the podium, place your plan on the table, and identify yourself, please.
My name is Karen McManuel. I work for Associated Engineering Consultants. I'm here representing the owner.
Mm-hmm.
We are proposing, there's a property, the owner owns Pembroke North, the apartments behind, and they also own the piece of property between Lancaster Avenue and the apartments. So they are proposing to demo the existing duplex that's there and add parking spaces.
Okay.
As far as trees, there are a couple of trees being removed. However, the main tree, which is a twin 20-inch maple tree, when we started the project, was a diseased tree. It has since been removed because it had gotten so bad. The adjacent neighbor, the dentist, had been complaining. They park back there, so that particular tree has been removed. There's two other trees shown to be removed. They're 3-inch trees, and they're towards the back of the property.
And those trees are both 3-inch caliber, you said?
Yes.
Okay.
So as far as removal of trees, we're basically required to replace the one 20-inch tree. However, we are proposing some new parking, and the landscaping plan, which should be the last drawing, we are proposing to add 3 deciduous trees and 1 evergreen tree in the front, along with some shrubs and plantings along the street. Access to the street is going to go away, and we've made it a green area and a planted area. In addition, part of the requirement and approval for the project with the adjacent neighbors, there is a row of evergreens that'll be planted along the property line. So we'll be adding a lot of landscaping as part of this project.
Those are all evergreens along there?
Along the property line, the depth of, yes. They, actually, there's 3 different types that are called out. There is the arborvitae, there's a holly, and a hemlock.
Karen, on C1.1, there are several trees that are indicated to the east side of the asphalt gravel driveway.
Yes, they're on the neighbor's property,
Okay.
and the majority of those trees have been taken down by the neighbor.
Are they within the 10-foot requirement of the ordinance that you need to identify?
They are within 10 feet of the property line. That's why we had originally identified them.
Right.
But when we had submitted these drawings, I didn't realize they had been taken down. I've just recently been told that they were taken down. So that's why they're not shown on the drawing right now, because I was unaware that they had taken them down.
All the ones that you're showing are there? Or you're saying that they are shown on the drawing but aren't there anymore?
Correct. There are A lot of it was smaller trees and underbrush that they had cleaned up. There are a couple of trees. There's a couple of 10-inch trees and a couple 12-inch trees that have been removed.
Did you point them out?
The trees that are shown on here and towards the front, and then most of the ones towards the back is a shrub area, like less than 6-inch caliber trees. But there is a couple in the front here that have been removed.
So those two right next to the street there are gone.
I believe so.
It's about the first 25 feet,
Yeah.
the first 30 feet. and
I was gonna say that, yeah.
Curb cut. Have been removed.
Greg's the owner here, so it would be the 12, the 5, the 12 and the 10. So if we were to count them that we needed to replace those, even though they're on the adjacent property's owner, we would have, we're putting in 4 trees. And we're required, without those trees, to replace 1 tree. So if we counted those 3 trees, 1 12, actually 2 12s and 1 10, that would be 3 more trees that we would be required to plant, and we're proposing to plant 4.
Okay, and the type of tree you're suggesting is honey locust?
The 3 deciduous are a honey locust tree, and the evergreen is a Norway spruce. And there's various shrubs along the sidewalk and street for a front buffer.
Would you show where the Norway spruce is going?
Okay.
And then the evergreen barrier, you're also planting, is that right?
Yes, all along the property line here,
Okay, and
the
that
evergreen.
consists of,
That consists of dark American arborvitae, Stevens holly, and a Canadian hemlock.
Are any of the trees shown in the front there existing, like the big one along Lax Drive?
The one big one out front here is an existing tree.
All right, well, that's my only plan.
Yes, that is existing. We're not removing that. That's why we have the sidewalk coming out and around the tree.
and that's an 8-inch maple, is that the tree?
The
that you just
existing
talked
one?
about, the existing tree?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
that's the 8-inch maple.
The, what's your scale on here, Karen? I'm sorry, I'm not,
1 inch equals 20 feet
okay.
are the plans.
Okay. The choice of your buffer plants,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Bill is more the expert in this than I, but I would like to open the discussion at least, but to my knowledge, Nellie Stevens is somewhat marginal in this area. Is it still considered that or not?
Yeah, I don't think it's been damaged for a while,
Yeah,
so.
everybody's memory's
Yeah,
short, but.
the one I'd have the biggest concern on would be the hemlock, actually,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
that'll get about 40 feet wide. And so unless you were able to keep it, or allow it to be that wide, it's just going to be a pruning problem or a challenge. And so you might want to substitute, it's all right for you to plant hemlock, but it also has some disease and insect issues too. And I think in that spot, it would have some more. You might want to replace it with either green giant arborvitae or western arborvitae. both of which will stay relatively narrow and should be able to survive those conditions quite well.
What kind of arborvitae?
Green giant or western arborvitae.
Okay, I don't think that's a problem.
So that's a suggestion, that's
Okay.
up to you. Yep. And I don't have a problem with the holly. I think the holly could
Okay.
do all right.
Real quick, Howard, the plant material that we saw on the first plan,
Right.
all that's gone, right? All that along the property line?
There'll be a couple of existing trees that'll stay in the middle of the property that will stay, that are there and will not be removed.
They're just going to be intermingled with your new
Right,
hedges
they'll
then?
be right.
Okay.
There are a lot of small, like 3-inch caliber, 4-inch caliber trees.
That was it.
Okay, anybody have anything else? Okay,
Okay.
Yep.
We'll replace the hemlock with the other variations.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night now. I do not see any hazardous tree reports. Is anybody aware of any?
No.
Okay. The other business that I would like to address tonight, and I don't suggest that we solve any problems this evening, but I would at least like to start discussion, is the township is performing evaluations of all of its ordinances, pretty much across the board, because most of these ordinances, or many of them, were last reviewed in the early 90s, so many of them have been implemented and not brought up to speed within perhaps 20 years. The shade tree ordinance is one of those, and there have been meetings with township staff and commissioners and myself and several others regarding the shade tree ordinance. And I'd just like to highlight some of the initial concerns that have been brought to the table. And some of the suggested improvements to the shade tree ordinance have been the following. Apparently, there seems to be somewhat of a lack of follow-up of enforcement of the ordinance, and especially regards to development plans that have been approved. This is not any one particular person's problem. It seems to be a question of the township's ability to seriously monitor what development plans are suggesting that they're going to do. We're discovering many tree removal companies are operating within the township without a license. And then properly licensed companies are removing trees without proper permitting. And one of the staff members of the township did some research and suggested that only 70 permits have been issued over the last 10 years, and we certainly know that there's been more than 70 trees removed in the township in the past 10 years. There's some discussion about emergency removals occurring without knowledge of shade tree and without any replanting. That particular issue is one that needs to be considered. I mean, emergency removal is an emergency removal. But then how do we catch up with it once we know about it? There's a concern that large shade trees are being replaced by shrubs and smaller species, and we, as the Shade Tree Commission, have often encouraged people who come before us to plant significant species, not necessarily just ornamental trees, but there is a concern that we should amend the ordinance to suggest larger specimen trees.
It's happening on my street. In fact, I sent you an email on it,
Yes.
and they've since planted a couple.
Okay. Apparently, there is some new technologies out there as to how trees can be planted in parking lots, and that's to be reviewed. Some of the other issues is changing the current language in the ordinance to require funding be put in escrow or bond, such that the landowner or development has to adhere to the plans and requirements before getting their escrow or bond back, and then add option to pay fees into replanting rather than to replant on site. That issue's come before us several times in the past. And sometimes we suggest that rather than plant on an already overcrowded site, that the developer or the property owner consider donating trees to the township for planting elsewhere. This puts a slightly different twist on that, in that if a particular site is too crowded to replant new trees, that the owner or developer would then contribute to a fund to the township, and then the township would disperse those funds towards the planting of trees elsewhere. General increase of fines for violations when they're known. Research parking lot configuration, incorporate more detailed requirements for trees in lots. Again, there is some new knowledge as to how trees can be incorporated into parking lots other than the current island suggestion the township has in its current ordinance. Make consequences to tree companies of removal without permit. The way the ordinance is written now, if a tree comes down without a permit or without knowledge of the Shade Tree Commission, it is the owner's responsibility. However, it is being considered that the tree company themselves have some liability in that decision. And then to hire an arborist to assist in the follow-up and enforcement of the shade tree ordinance. And hopefully some of these increased fines for violations or funds to replant might help fund an arborist. A second part of the review is what's called a woodland protection ordinance. And the basic idea is to limit the disturbance on the most sensitive and important areas of valuable woodlands. There are still several areas within Radnor Township that are of considerable acreage as woodlands, and it is the desire of several that those woodlands be protected in somewhat different fashion than just the general provisions under the Shade Tree Commission. In essence, to identify those areas, additional mapping will be required to identify the concerned woodland areas. And then there will be discussion as to whether this type of ordinance would stand alone and mirror other natural resource protection ordinances, or whether it would be blended in with the Shade Tree ordinance. So those are kind of the highlights of what is being discussed currently. And I forwarded this to you all as an email several days ago, and I'm sure you've not had time to, consider it in great depth. But if you have any ideas for discussion here, I would certainly be willing to hear what your thoughts are.
The points look like good points and ones that we've noted in past meetings as being concerns here. So I think you're addressing the concerns we've brought up here and that I have as one of the members.
Okay.
Howard, again, these are great points. What's our next step from this outline as far as continuing the process to try to move along?
Yeah, the next step is they would be, the commissioners will be charging a subcommittee of sorts to review these issues and define them, to quantify them, that they are, this is not just talk. These are real issues that are evident in the township. And once those issues are brought to the Board of Commissioners, maybe not every one of these items is going to be addressed, but hopefully the majority of them will be. The subcommittees, again, there are subcommittees all across the ordinance review process. And the whole idea is to keep these discussions open and in public for public discussion. I would anticipate that most likely by December, the Board of Commissioners will have some recommendations on what ordinances get revised and how. And that's really the best I know at this point.
But that's all ordinances, not just this one.
It's not just this one. No, there are several that are being reviewed.
Like the planning, the plan institutional uses right now.
Right, plan institutional uses being reviewed. This one's being reviewed. I think several others are also. Mhm.
As I had said, I had sent you an email, I think,
Yeah.
about especially places like North Warren where they take down, the old trees rot and die, and then they plant these little, instead of I think umbrella trees is what I'm thinking. That's not the right word, but canopy trees.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And they're not planting canopy trees.
Right.
Is that something we should put in this ordinance?
I think they're addressing that when they're saying that we should change the suggested list of plantings to recommend more significant canopy trees. If you look at the list of trees we have as approved trees in our current ordinance, there are a significant amount of ornamentals. And when we're sitting here and discussing number of trees and calipers, et cetera, oftentimes people are planting the ornamentals, and we're saying, no, you need to put some larger canopy trees in. I think they'll probably be looking for some sort of more significant language that suggests the canopy trees in the ordinance itself. There is a place for ornamentals. I know we planted North Wayne about 20 years ago in a significant way, and we chose some ornamentals intentionally because of the power line issue.
Mm-hmm.
So on one side of the street, it's all ornamentals, and the other side of the street, it's all canopy. But that's not such a horrible thing. But I think when it comes to development itself, the developers need to know that they should first be considering the canopy trees, not the ornamentals.
I don't even think you should worry about the power lines. That's the utility company's problem.
The one issue with the power lines is that they then go in and hack up the trees, and it tends to, it's not a good situation. So I think there does need to be some flexibility where there's a need for a shorter tree. I think that makes sense, but, you know, it could be that there's an incentive to plant the bigger trees, that, you know, you don't have to plant as many of those, or in reverse, so you have to plant many more of the smaller trees, and that there be a, you know, perhaps if there is a limitation with something overhead, but most cases that we're dealing with are not overhead wires, and so that's usually not an issue that, what we're seeing anyway, that would be when planting street trees.
I think some of the discussions that are going to arise, which I will be bringing to you or keeping you informed, is the escrow issue and the increase of fines for violations. I think personally that is, you know, we all have observed over and over the issue of enforcement. And the issue of enforcement comes down to funding. And if the funds aren't there to enforce, the enforcement isn't going to happen. So one of the major things we're going to be looking at is, you know, what are equitable fines and escrows? And hopefully those fines and escrows can help fund the enforcement process.
It also seems reasonable that fees would be part of this also, that it wouldn't just be funding the enforcement individual by fines, but also that, because the enforcement is also needed by, just to police the ones that are doing what they've promised to do. And so I don't understand the fee structure well enough, but it seems to me that that's a reasonable aspect.
Okay.
I think your group has done an excellent job. I think you've really thought this through and discussed it well, and taken into consideration things that we've discussed at these meetings. So I appreciate that.
Well, the current administration obviously has a considerable respect for the trees in Radnor Township and the overall environmental quality of the township. So I think that's, you know, I can't take the blame or the credit for this. So, any other discussion on? Okay, and again, I will be keeping you all informed through email as this goes along. I think they're hoping to have one of these subcommittee meetings the end of August. And I will, again, keep you informed of the time and place if you two would wish to participate. Okay. Okay. Well, that is it for the July meeting, and see you next month.